All right. So Wendy, here it is, your new space.
Oh my God, I love it. I love the tile.
You've got your drain in, tied into it. Okay. We're basically fixtures at this point, and then we've got your millwork and we've got some floor work to do, but for the most part, we're really close.
Fabulous job, sir. Fabulous job.
Thank you. Well, thank you. And I will say you made it so much easier because of all the work you put in prior to getting the grease trap. What was the grease trap process for you? Because it's been devastating for a lot of businesses in the last, I don't know, several years, especially since I've been in town.
When we started looking to expand, and we were talking to different people, including you, about different spots, I called him to try and get out ahead of the situation to see what he was going to want. And one of the first places we looked at was called Center Goes down on Pacific Avenue. And this place was done up. The guy had just outfitted it to be a franchise. And it was brand new grease trap, brand new refrigeration, brand new everything. And I called about that. He said that the grease trap was inadequate for our service. And
really?
It took me a long time on the phone with him to nail down the specifics of what that meant, you know? And when I finally did, it came out to, it was about sales. So it was like how much volume you were moving every day. We had to go back through a couple of months of sales receipts, document everything, and prove that we didn't serve more than a certain amount of meals every day in order to stay within the threshold of that. So we got that hammered out, but then that did not go through. So then by the time I'd talked to you, I already had everything in and had documented everything for our sales numbers so that he couldn't really turn us down for what we wanted to do here. I think the scariest thing for me is none of it was clear.
I think the regulations that they're using, when I read through them, it isn't straightforward. And the directions they give you, and they don't really make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
We've got a meeting today with the city, actually, and several people with a grease trap manufacturer. And we're gonna sit down and we're gonna throw out some new policies and new ideas to try to make things easier and more affordable, because it's been a problem.
Right.
And it hasn't been addressed. And the way it's been addressed, I don't think it's not moving the needle. And I think they've even considered a Band-Aid themselves. We don't need Band-Aids. We need solutions for these problems.
The regulations were choking out the small business people and favoring people with more money, chain restaurants, franchises. And I don't want to see that happen in Tacoma, because that's not how Tacoma is. You know, Tacoma is very much independent. Our customers come out to support small business in big ways. You know, and you see a lot of innovation here. You see the folks at Side Piece Kitchen or Buddy's Chicken and Waffles that had to do their own battles to get where they are, and the community loves them and comes out for them. It will crush the independent restaurant industry in Tacoma if something isn't done about this.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Reed Fetters with Tacoma Rising, and I want to thank you guys for joining us. I've got two amazing guests tonight, and we're going to be talking about grease traps. So I have Kristine Sherred with the News Tribune, and I have Luke Erickson with United Sales Northwest up from Vancouver, Washington.
Representing Shear Grease Interceptors here in the Northwest.
Well, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
To start this out, I really want to get into some of the negative just headaches and issues we've run into grease traps with Tacoma. And then I want to talk about solutions and how to fix those things. What could we do moving forward? So, Kristine, we're going to just start with you. You've written several articles about the problems and the struggles that we've been running into. Can you kind of give us a high level of what those problems have been?
Sure. So I guess I'll start by saying that Tacoma has insisted that its policy has not changed, but a few years ago, essentially during the pandemic, from what my reporting has shown, the city adjusted its approach to the management of it. So essentially what that has meant is that just within the past few years, restaurants in Tacoma that are new or that have changed hands have run into what I have sort of termed the grease trap gauntlet of Tacoma. And it's become so known that, you know, restaurant folks talk to each other, and the reputation that has followed has not been great for the city, I would say. So at its most basic, restaurants that are new or changing hands as they're going through the process of opening, they're talking with the health department, going through all sorts of plan reviews and things like that. They've usually leased a building, or maybe they own it. In most cases, they're just renting. And they learn that they need to do really, they're told by the city, essentially, in a lot of cases for full service restaurants, that they need to do a really kind of intensive infrastructure project that involves tearing out the floor and installing these huge gravity grease interceptors. And for most businesses, that is, it's not really financially sensible for many of them. And in some cases, it also feels just generally a little bit unnecessary. But the process of just kind of working through all of that from the restaurant owner's perspective has been really frustrating, especially because there's just one person at the city of Tacoma who manages this program, the Fats, Oils, and Grease program, in the Environmental Services Department. And so what that has led to is just a really kind of complicated back and forth with one person who's managing, there's more than 1,000 food service businesses that the city oversees. And they have felt like the demands are kind of far and beyond what, in many cases, some of them have experienced in other places. I've talked with a lot of people who who either actively have businesses in other places, including nearby Seattle, or have operated restaurants in other cities, other states, et cetera. And the grease trap situation in Tacoma feels very different, even though they have a lot of experience in the industry.
So I know I run into this same problem when in design, restaurant design, and it comes down to how many sinks you have, basically which sinks go into the grease trap. And once you get into a certain amount of sinks, which is not very many, you're pushed towards this gravity grease interceptor, which is basically this huge concrete box that you dig up the sidewalk, the parking lot, anything outside, it's got to go outside, and you bury it.
Wow.
And it's a huge cost.
Right.
And that's where we start running into problems, where that cutoff of getting something under your sink that's actually visible and you can get to and it's easy to do, it's really, you run into it pretty quickly before you have to go out, into this huge gravity tank or concrete tank or steel tank, which Luke, we'll get into that too in a minute. But when you run into, like, when you question the city, like, what is the feedback? What do you get back? Because I get pushed that way, and I believe there's other solutions. And the headaches that we get, it comes down to cost. Mm-hmm. And so we get price as either you're the landlord or the business owner. You're getting price out of what you're trying to do, because the cost of doing these big, giant grease interceptors is just too big. And when folks go back and say, hey, can we do something else? What kind of feedback are you getting back from the city?
So what I've heard from restaurant owners, and is sort of outlined in some of the stories that I've written about this really enthralling topic, right, is that first and foremost, like, for a lot of folks, it's really just the city putting its foot down and saying, like, no, this is just our rule. And what has happened is that, like, for a lot of full service restaurants have been told to do this work. And in some cases, like, one of the main anecdotes in my first story from last year was a bar on 6th Avenue. The place has been a restaurant for 15, 20 years probably. And the FOG program manager told them to do this work, and they literally physically can't. There's nowhere for them to even do that. And the most frustrating part is having to have this, like, just kind of ridiculous back and forth trying to tell somebody, like, this is just physically impossible, not even aside from the financial aspect. So there are instances like that where it's just simply not possible, but they're still being told that because, like, quote unquote, that's the rule. When you meet their threshold, which is relatively low. And then when it comes to the cost, that, more often than not is what especially small business owners are running into. Like, they just the quotes, the machines themselves start at like $30,000 minimum, $50,000. And then you're talking about like tens of thousands of dollars in labor and fees and permits to actually do the work to install something like that.
We're talking about the gravity, the big ones, the big tanks.
So when people are told to do this, they're like, I don't have $100,000, right? In some cases, they don't even have like $20,000 to spare. And the process of trying to get the city to sort of meet them where they're at has probably been like the biggest hang up and the most kind of upsetting part of this conundrum for Tacoma's small restaurants. Because for many people, it kind of feels like they're just constantly running into a brick wall. And instead of the city kind of saying that, they're there to help them get their business open, it really feels like they're just putting up hurdles after hurdle in front of them and not really offering alternatives. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is that actually, about 80%, by the city's own estimates, 80% of food service entities in their purview use the smaller machines, the hydromechanical machines. So 8 out of 10 places, right? And yet new businesses have just been running into this ask, basically, that they want everybody to not use the smaller ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I ran into that here at the Road Center with a couple restaurants I submitted. Instead of having some individual, there's 3 restaurants, and 2 of them required small grease, basically hydromechanical, because they didn't have the need. But since we had 3, the request came back on one of the restaurants was basically, hey, for a location or a site that has multiple businesses, we'd like for you to put in a large gravity outside. And I was like, well, who's going to pay for that? The landlord doesn't want to pay for that. I mean, it's a bad business decision. Like, you can't afford to drop $100,000, $150,000, sometimes $200,000, because you don't know what you're getting into in that sidewalk. I mean, you uncover it.
Yeah.
You're moving utilities and all sorts of stuff. And then the time to do that, it gets ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so for them to come back, not only to suggest that we do that, but then to let the landlord carry the responsibility for the grease trap for all the businesses in there, well, that's not right either. So I think that I pushed back on that, and we're going to resubmit and kind of go a different direction with that. And I think we'll get through it. But I think that response isn't helpful.
What's so fascinating about that is that the code technically says that it's the individual business's responsibility. Mm-hmm. So the code itself doesn't really support the idea of a building owner that has multiple restaurants in it.
Yeah, that's what I got back, which is why I'm asking about the feedback. And part of the feedback, we just sat down with some folks in the city and the chamber, and I think we had a really good conversation about kind of how can we move forward, and we'll get into that in a minute. But one thing that they mentioned that about was the flyer that was released. And in short...
The flyer.
I know, right? It was like... and when I heard about it, I was like, wait, we did what? And it was basically a flyer that put the responsibility of letting the businesses, the business owners be... the landlords and the brokers had to let the business owners know that before they signed a lease that grease traps were required, and they need to find out about what that requirement is before they sign a lease. I think I don't know if I'm hitting that right, but in short, that's kind of what it is. And it basically said, hey, we're going to move our responsibility as a city onto the landlords and the brokers, which makes absolutely no sense. It's not to me, and I know they're trying to help and work through stuff, and they're trying to get the education out, which I do think is good. But the policies and things that they're working on is just, this is a math equation. This is engineering. This is innovation. And those are how we solve this issue. It's not a policy thing moving back. And I think once we got Luke, you into the conversation and we started talking through that, I think that is going to change it. But I wanted to talk about the feedback, because I think some of the feedback is not accurate. It's all over the map. And when you read the fog stuff, like I looked at it and it's like, I was kind of like, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. And when you try to work through it, it's like, why are we cutting it off here and going straight to gravity after nine DFUs?
9 DFUs.
Which is 9 DFUs is a 3-basin sink. So if you have a anything more than a 3-basin
That's like
sink,
a small cafe.
right? But mop sinks, there's certain. Well, let's talk about that. Certain sinks have to go into the grease trap. A meat sink, the mop sink. Sometimes it's the dishwasher, the commercial dishwasher, the 3-basin sink, and there's more. But if you have anything more than a 3-basin sink, you're going gravity. Per the code, unless I might be missing some stuff there. And
the only thing you're missing is the ability to serve more than 40 meals per hour and 40 seats. Right. If you've got those two things, you automatically jump to a gravity.
Right.
But and this is what Kristine was saying, is how they changed it during the pandemic, and how they administered their requirements with your DoorDash and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
So now they're saying just because you're available to make deliveries, now we're saying, well, you have the capability of doing more than 40 per hour, even though you don't have any seats at all. Maybe you have the capability. Now we're saying you need a gravity grease interceptor.
Right.
Even though that, what's the reality, right? Are you going to do, 5 or 10 an hour?
Right.
Doesn't matter. You have the capability to do it.
Right.
So now you have to jump up to this. So, they're really looking at a worst case scenario and then, saying we want to plan for that worst case scenario, regardless of what reality is. And Mr. Business Owner, this is what you have to pay.
Right.
Yeah.
You're doing
Very punitive.
You're going to do the same thing that McDonald's has to do. Right, like at some high level, like no drive-through, but we're going to come in there.
Yeah,
and,
they really, the DoorDash delivery thing has been like such a weird sticking point because they basically, from everything that I have learned, that was a pandemic era creation, which feels particularly cruel considering in 2020 restaurants
they took a hit anyway.
took a huge hit.
Yeah.
And then we hit them again.
And then the math doesn't the math doesn't even work out, because if you worked in restaurants, talked to anybody in the restaurant industry, and just looked at sales data from 2020, the idea that restaurants were doing more business in 2020 is not true. There's always exceptions. But for the most part, like the restaurants that we're talking about are places that were doing like 10, 20% of their normal sales if they were lucky. So the hardest part of all of this is with the delivery and with, the worst case scenario is that it kind of ignores the city's approach to it and the calculation, even with the 40 seat thing, 40 meals, like it just kind of ignores how restaurants actually function. And it really feels like, and this is the biggest thing that I've heard from restaurant owners and people in the industry, is that it really feels like nobody actually it's almost like they've never been in a restaurant. And it seems like they've never worked in a restaurant, right? Because even if you're on DoorDash, a lot of places that use it are just using it to supplement, right? And then there's also research in sales data that shows that these third-party delivery platforms are not they're not adding to sales as much as they're replacing other sales. People are maybe using DoorDash instead of calling, right? People aren't really calling restaurants anymore. So it's really just kind of been a shift.
If we don't change the regulations, right? If we don't get a solution here from where we're headed or where we're going right now, what does it mean for businesses trying to open a restaurant today? What does it mean for existing businesses that are kind of getting the knock on the door about saying, hey, we found out that you're not up to date on this grease trap, or welcoming businesses into Tacoma, right? Because we want more business in Tacoma, and it'd be great to have more restaurants. What does that tell the business community if we're not a restaurant-friendly town?
Yeah. To your point about being like McDonald's, in this time frame that we're talking about, like since 2020, basically, there have been a lot of chains that have opened in Tacoma. And in many cases, and I've tried to make this point to the city, if a McDonald's or a Chick-fil-A, those kinds of places open, they're quite literally building from the ground up.
Yeah.
They're building their own building. And, they're also large corporate chains. So the idea of installing one of these things is not, is kind of like jump change for them to a certain extent. And also I would add that there are fast food chains that don't have what we're talking about. And when I made that point earlier about the fact that 80% of restaurants in Tacoma are using these smaller machines anyways, what I've also found is that the city's follow-up on it is not as strong as its initial demands, if that makes sense. So in terms of the oversight of them, after that initial request is kind of lacking. And the impact on all of this is that, it scared people away. I know of people who, have just been people who have struggled for like 2 years. And if you get down into it with them as to why, the grease interceptor was a huge part of that time. And it also gets around. Like, the restaurant community is a tight-knit community. I know that there are people who have been exploring opening a business in Tacoma, especially folks who maybe have restaurants elsewhere in the region. And they have heard the horror stories, and it's scared people away. And, people will go somewhere else. Like, there are places, downtown Puyallup might be a little easier to deal with. And next thing you know, businesses are opening there instead of here. I really think that Tacoma can't afford to put up these kinds of barriers. There's a lot of empty storefronts in this town, especially downtown where we are right now. And what are they going to be? Like a boutique? A lot of them really need to become a restaurant.
You can't have a city like Tacoma that is thriving. Like, it is a food and bev town. It really is. Every time I go out to dinner, every place I go, like, it seems like it's full. Like, there's the restaurants I like going to, they're always busy. There's always, and this is from my opinion, we have capacity for more. We could have
100%.
more restaurants. And there are some restaurants here that I know of right now that are established restaurants that part of the things of them expanding in another store or another restaurant is the cost of doing a grease interceptor because of what we have to do, what we push them through. So with that being said, Luke, let's define what types of options are out there, because we've been talking about these gravity grease interceptors, which the city wants us to go towards, but is that the right option? I want to get that out because I want a good answer on that one.
Well, and
just say no. Just
it's
don't
a bad option.
Yeah, thank you.
it is a bad option. Gravity grease interceptors. They're concrete. They're big boxes. They're expensive. They're to buy. They're expensive to install, and they're guaranteed to fail. Right? I mean, so is a hydromechanical grease interceptor made out of steel. Right? They're guaranteed to fail. A grease interceptor.
When do they fail? Let's talk about that.
Well,
when do they fail for a steel, and when do the concrete ones fail?
The average life of a steel interceptor in the United States is 5 years. The average life of a gravity grease interceptor in the United States is 11 years.
So let's just talk about that real quick, because
11 years for $100,000.
Right, that's the impact, and the it just blows my mind that we're using those because we think they are environmentally friendly and they're saving our waterways and our sewers, and in fact they are not. We're burying these boxes and they only last 11 years, right, or 5 years at some level, and I don't think people know that, and that to me is one of the most impactful things. And I cut you off, but I just want that to sink in. It
needs to stick, and that's not something I made up. That's from the WRF data. It's like the environmental report from manufacturer Shear compiles all that data and regurgitates.
I Googled it. It's true. It's out there.
It's out there. It's not. It's independent research data that has been compiled. So, and that's the average across the United States. So these things are getting replaced regularly at a high cost. Which, if you're mandating a gravity grease interceptor, then you're going to have to replace that cost every 10 or 11, 12 years. That's a big chunk of an operating budget that, as a restaurant owner, you have to plan for. And then you're talking about changing, a space and then having to come into current requirements, and then you got to spend that money to expand your restaurant, it's a big prohibition. Now, there's a lot of other jurisdictions and a lot of other ways to do it, and a high capacity hydromechanical grease interceptor, which obviously Shear makes those, but so do a lot of other manufacturers, right? And there's a lot, and I could sit here with all my competition in that realm, they'd all say the exact same thing as I am, right? The high capacity hydromechanical grease interceptor is a solution for all of it. It's third-party tested. You're going to get a high percentage of grease retention through that interceptor, and it's going to protect the whole system, right?
And when you say systems, you mean the sewer systems,
the
waterways
systems,
that
right?
go down
right
past the building or whatever the restaurant.
Exactly, right. So as a restaurant owner or a food service provider, your responsibility is pre-treatment of your effluent, right? The ratepayers should not be paying for the treatment of your effluent because they're not creating it, you are, and you're creating profit off of it, so you should treat it. So that's fair. I mean, that's what the city of Tacoma is doing.
Right.
But what they're missing is, how efficient is a gravity grease interceptor? How much grease are they actually capturing? What percentage are they bypassing versus capturing? And how much protection are you actually providing to your downstream system? And a gravity grease interceptor has zero information on any of that. All those questions I just asked are, I don't know. You don't have any protection that is guaranteed. There is no testing. There's no third party. A gravity grease interceptor is built to a construction standard. It's build me a box with an inlet and outlet, a baffle and a crossover. And as long as it meets these criteria, we're going to stamp it, we're going to certify it, and we're going to call it a grease interceptor. Well, how much flow can we put through that? I don't know. How much grease does it hold? I don't know. What's the percentage of grease, efficiency will it hold at the given flow rate? I don't know. Right? All we do know is Tacoma is going to make you pump it out when it's 25% of the wetted volume is grease. We're going to make you pump it out, right? How much of that 25% of grease that we captured, how much of that stuff had already bypassed? And when we were today at the Chamber of Conference meeting, they mentioned, it wasn't the Chamber of Commerce, it was one of your articles, Kristine, where you had written about the compliance of that 25% rule, right? So they get those reports, the pumping contractors pump out the grease interceptors, and they'll say, oh, there's this many inches of water and this many inches of grease, and you can do the math to figure out what's 25%. And they give those to the city, and the city looks at them, and I think it was something like, it's a large percentage. It was like half of them. I think it was 47% is what you wrote in your article, were exceeding that 25% when they were getting serviced. So, they're, by their own admission, they're not even enforcing the 25% rule as efficiently as they could, which in my mind means you're bypassing even more grease.
Yeah.
Right? Because and that's kind of why that 25% rule exists. And it's not a Tacoma thing. It's a nationwide thing where that rule of thumb has been accepted. Why 25%? And you look into the history of that, and I've got some pretty smart guys at Shear that have looked into the history of that, and they can't really tell you why. It's just been accepted.
It just was accepted.
It's just why.
That's what I was told.
Right. It's not because at 30% starts bypassing more grease. No. When you get into it, there's just, that was somebody made that up and it caught across the realm, and that's kind of what everybody applied, and they did it, so I did it. Right?
And the city's defense of all of this has been like, oh, well, people are regularly exceeding this 25%. And my research has shown that they don't actually even really know if that's true or not because of the sort of minimal oversight that they're actually doing of the cleaning.
Inspections.
The system that you're talking about where the cleaning companies
submit the reports.
That only is happening digitally in that way when it's a professional third-party company coming to do the cleaning.
Point.
And there's only a few hundred places that are addresses that have that happening. And again, 1,000, 1,200 businesses. So there's 800, 900 businesses in Tacoma that are not going through that digital system, presuming they're self-cleaning. But the city does random inspections as required by the EPA. If the EPA still exists in a that cleaning metric has been a point of frustration with restaurant folks too, because essentially if you're marked at 33%, you're marked as having failed, but there's no nuance to that, right? Of like the machine is still maybe theoretically doing its job.
Right.
And then a lot of folks have made the argument too of, okay, well, if I have to keep it at this 25% threshold, I'll just clean it when it needs to be cleaned, right?
Well, and there's more nuance to that 25% rule, because typically within the United States, jurisdictions only apply that 25% rule to gravity grease interceptors. Tacoma applies it to every grease interceptor.
Do.
So even when you do have a hydromechanical or even a high capacity hydromechanical, like you get a shear installed at a restaurant, and when we test them to a third party tests them to the 97, 98% efficiency before they fail. And 98% of the wetted volume is grease before we bypass anything more than 3% of the grease. That's unfair to say, oh, that hydromechanical high capacity grease interceptor can only hold 25%. Well, I can tell you without a doubt that up to 95%, we're only bypassing 1 to 1.5% of the grease under worst case scenarios, because we tested it, third party certified it, and I got my test reports online that you can look at and see exactly how we tested it and what the results were, right? So there's more to it. It is more nuance to that.
Talking about the grease traps, or the grease traps, the gravity grease interceptors, and the cost of those versus the cost of these high capacity hydromechanical grease interceptors, right? We're just talking kind of there's a lot of different options with the hydro, but with the gravity, right? We've already talked about that it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know of one case that was over $200,000 to get a 1,500 gallon gravity grease interceptor into a parking lot, under the parking lot for a restaurant locally. But the cost of the mechanical, or we'll say the high capacity hydromechanical, it's a fraction. It's 10%.
So when you're comparing like a retrofit situation, absolutely, maybe even less than 10%, right? Because it's a small box, it's HDPE, it's lifetime warranted. It holds, instead of 25% of the wetted volume, it might be 95, 98, 90% of the wetted volume can hold the grease at an extremely high efficiency. Again, third party tested. So you're talking about being able to put, a 100-gallon box or a 200-gallon box and hold, sometimes as much or more or double what a gravity grease interceptor can hold out in the parking lot. So you're installing something that's a lot smaller, a lot more efficient, cheaper to buy, and then cheaper to install. And I think that's where you get is the installation differences.
Well,
huge costs.
The installation, if it's under 10%, right? We're talking $100,000, right? Versus $10,000.
Sure.
Something, and it's every case is different, right? That's just the development cost,
Correct.
the initial. Let's talk about pumping these things.
Yeah.
What's the cost difference? How do you talk about that?
Yeah. So if you were to call one of the local pumping contractors and ask them, how much does it cost to show up to pump out a grease interceptor, they're going to give you an X cost to show up and pump out a minimum number of, or a maximum number of gallons, right? The ones I'm familiar with down in Oregon, Portland, and Southwest Washington are about a 250 gallon minimum or maximum, right? You pay $300 and they'll pump out 250 gallons for that $300. And now if you have more than 250 gallons, now they're charging you a per gallon cost addition, right? So if you've got 1,000 gallon, $1,250 or $1,500, now that $250 service call might be $600, $700, $800, $900 as opposed to that minimum, right? Now, the amount of grease that you're pumping out might be the exact same, but they don't charge per pound of grease. They charge per gallon of
mixed
wetted
up in there.
volume.
Mixture or whatever's in there.
Right.
So a couple $100 for a hydromechanical versus
maybe
800
to 1,000. It depends on how big that gravity grease interceptor is. You did some research on that.
Yes, I just wanted to pop in to say that this is
you mean pop in like in the you're here?
Yeah,
you
pop in
the
to say
conversation?
that in continuation of the city's defense of its existing policy that, sort of prefers the large gravity grease interceptors, also in how they explain it to restaurants. If the restaurant owner sort of asks these kinds of questions, the response that they have provided is that you have to clean, the larger ones require less frequent cleaning. So they have basically made the argument that like it's farther out of sight, farther out of mind. You might only need, allegedly, to have that large gravity grease interceptor pumped maybe every 6 months, which is funny because the code actually says that they should be cleaned at least every 3 months, but they also have in another document that it could be 6 months, which I pointed out to them. We'll see if that discrepancy is resolved. But the smaller ones, might have to be cleaned more frequently, but they can be self-cleaned. They don't have to be professionally cleaned. You can't obviously like put your hand down into a giant concrete box under a sewer manhole in the parking lot. But the in-house ones, to me, there seems to be a benefit to like, you can see it, you can access it readily. Yes, they do need to be cleaned, but the per cost is lower. And there's also a real, like, just kind of basic question of economic cash flow in a business that plays into, right? Like they might have $200 a month, but not $1,000 a month, or $1,000 every 3 months, whatever.
Well, let's dig into that, because you hit a good point that you're going to talk about, but you said 6 months or longer.
That's a bad idea.
Please explain.
Yes,
why.
please explain.
Grease is a very acidic substance. In a grease interceptor, the longer it goes, the more acidic it becomes. The more acidic that environment becomes, the more it's going to break down whatever it's sitting in. If it's in a something that can be corroded, right? In the case of a gravity concrete grease interceptor, it will eat the walls, right? So you talk about 11 years average replacement. Well, if you're pumping that thing out once every 6 months or once a year, you're probably not going to get 11 years out of it. You're probably only going to get 5 or 6, because the acidity of that effluent that's in there is going to eat those walls at a really high rate, and you're going to end up with a very, very quick failure. The other part of that is your pumping contractors that are going to get in there and pump everything out. After about it's usually around that 100-day mark, the grease, the layer of grease on the top starts to solidify. As it solidifies, it gets very, very hard, and you cannot just get in there and stir it up and pump it out through a hose. The pumping contractor is going to get in there, and they're going to have to break up that grease, and it's going to take them a very long time, and they are going to charge a lot of money because you got probably 2 or 3 guys there all day instead of 1 or 2 guys in and out in an hour, right? You pump it out, you hose it down, you pump it out again, you fill it up, and you leave. If it takes him 2 days to do that, they're charging for that. So that every 6-month cost might be 4, 5, 6 times the cost of doing it every 90 days. So it's really just not a good idea to go past that 90-day mark for any reason, right? Even if you have one that's totally corrosion free, like an HDPE lifetime warranted box that you don't have to worry about corroding, still a bad idea to go 6 months, because you're going to end up paying a lot more for your pumping.
So what you're saying is basically, maybe when we size these grease interceptors, we should be on a 90-day pump cycle.
That's the sweet spot.
90 days.
Anything shorter than 90 days, you're pumping too often.
We'll get one of those.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So when we start talking about, when we get into the high capacity hydromechanical or hydromechanical in general, we can talk a little bit more about that and how these things kind of start to fall in place to where it makes more sense. But let's just talk about the shit that doesn't make sense. Let's maybe make this podcast this should have been a podcast more about why don't we use gravity? Why should we not use gravity? And I didn't know this until we started talking about this a few months back. It's like, how bad is it? So if I'm understanding this conversation, it sounds like there's more reasons why we should not use them. So just in general, gravity, grease interceptor. So one, they're huge. They're very costly to install. They're made out of mostly either metal or porous concrete, and the life expectancy of the concrete is 11 years, maybe 10, depending on how often they they're cleaned. They're only 25, or so they say they're only 25% efficient. And so pump costs are big. They're not efficient. If they're corroding, they're probably creating more leaks and things around. That's not helping us either. What am I missing here? I feel like there's more. I'm only scratching the surface here.
Yeah, the other thing that I always like to point out is you have no idea how much grease that thing is actually bypassing. We know how much it's catching. How much is it bypassing? There's no test data that actually shows us what it is, how efficient it is. 25% of the wetted volume is what we say it's full at, right? But okay, what happens if I dump 20 pounds of grease down there? How much of that 20 pounds of grease actually gets retained in that box, and how much of that 20 pounds of grease goes out the outlet? Nobody knows.
That's the most critical piece, and that's what I want to like just take this as far as we can go and make it very clear that these gravity grease interceptors, they're not even tested. They're not third-party tested.
No.
We don't know. So when we're forced to use them as a designer, an engineer, architect, a business, and you ask, tell us why, tell us how good they are, no one can tell you.
Well, and the city is trying to protect the system, and yet they're using a device that you really don't know how much protection you're getting.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Why
not use a device that you actually could say, oh, I'm getting 97% of the grease coming out of here, and
It's
I know
also
it.
And they don't even know that. The city doesn't know that.
Yeah.
And it's not, and I'm not blaming anyone. It's just, it's been used for so long that they just think it's the way it is, the way it is.
Yeah, that's been a really funny part of this to me, is it's an incredibly antiquated system, and at one point they actually said to me, like, I don't know what you mean by new technology, and I was just kind of like, huh?
It's fair, right? Because there are still a lot of jurisdictions that are in that same realm as them. There's a lot of them that are looking at it totally different and have come into the whole grease production sizing methodology, which is the right way to right size it. And you want to protect everybody in the entire realm. That's the way to do it. Go through it with grease production sizing methodology. The American Society of Plumbing Engineering that's where all professional plumbing engineers, get a lot of their design data from. That's how they're taught, and they design out of the ASPE handbook. And the ASPE handbook says you size a grease interceptor using grease production sizing methodology. Right? It's not something that we made up.
There's math behind it. There's math, science, and testing behind what we should be doing. What other cities? Let's talk. Like, what are other cities doing? Like, I think you mentioned earlier that cities are actually not even allowing, or they're not even talking about.
There are some cities. There's some cities that have gone really far, and they won't allow anything other than shear, which I think is not right. They shouldn't do that. But there's a lot of places that will say, if it's a corrosionable or something that can corrode, a corrodable material, they're saying you're not allowed to use it. Right? No concrete, no metal. It has to be something that resists the acidic environment, and they just it's a blanket statement. If it's something that can corrode, you can't use it in a grease interceptor. Which that's a smart way to go about it, right? You can keep the way your sizing methodology by plumbing code, and give us something that we know we're not going to have to replace every 5 years or 10 or 11 years, because that's a disservice, to the food service establishment.
If you're the city of Tacoma and you're responsible for rewriting, which I think we all know we need to rewrite the regulations here. How do you approach that? Like, from your perspective, like, what would you do to correct where we are now? What would you do? What's the first step you would do?
I would rewrite the entire thing. And the easiest way to do it is let it go. Why can't plumbing code apply in the city of Tacoma? Why? That and we asked that today at the meeting, and the answer was, well, we have to comply with the Department of Health for Pierce County, right? And I'm like, well, why is the Department of Health?
That's not really well.
Yeah, that's what they said today.
Yeah, I didn't really understand.
I didn't understand that either.
I didn't like the Department of Health. In my opinion, they get to tell you how many sinks you need, and after it gets through the sink, they're not the ones that should be determining the grease trap sizes. Yeah. That's an engineering. That's a response to what sinks that you need to have
Yeah, that was a surprise to me.
Yeah.
Not much surprised me today. That did.
That might be a little bit of a misunderstanding.
That was and I was sitting there, I was like,
because
I don't
the
think that's
Tacoma
right.
Pierce County Health Department oversees all of Pierce County, as the name implies. And I know for a fact that how it is handled in Tacoma is different than how it is handled in Puyallup or Sumner or Lakewood. Or, there's a reason why the city of Lakewood, which is south of here, has a multitude of small businesses, many of which are owned by immigrants. And there's a reason why they're in Lakewood and not in Tacoma.
We need to have bigger conversations with experts in the room and more people in the room. And we shouldn't be I don't think we should have meetings when we don't have all the players in the room so people can ask questions and we can, like the having a meeting and then going off and having other conversations without the experts in the room is not probably the best. I think it's a great place to start, but I think there were some misconceptions today that I was like, I don't know, because I don't know enough about it.
It raises an interesting point that I have found, and like I was alluding to earlier with the city council on the flyer, it's complicated. Like, I'm not an engineer, and learning plumbing codes is a little bit complicated.
But it doesn't have to be. That's the problem.
No, but
you're right. Though.
But to your point about like having multiple stakeholders in the room and the conversation, like the Tacoma, the Chamber of Commerce has nothing to do with it. It is the city of Tacoma and the Environmental Services Department that is interpreting the city code in the way that it is. The Chamber of Commerce can,
put some pressure.
Oh, it's regulation at that point. Yeah,
and the city council, yes, like they hear it from their constituents, but it raises an interesting point that it is complicated. And the people who maybe mean well in trying to fix it, there's like a lot of voices in the room, right? And a lot of confusion. I mean, I even hear it sometimes from restaurants that are confused as sometimes they think they sort of conflate the city with the health department, and they are different. They have to work together, and they do work together to a certain extent. But I think it just goes to show.
We've got a lot of cooks in the kitchen on this, and I did a social media post that came up that I said it was something about everything Tacoma but the grease traps. And I'm dealing with grease traps on a different level than others are because I have to figure out how to make them work, get it past the city, and understand what's going in them. And you are the expert that I'm calling and saying, hey, what should we do here? What are your thoughts? And you give me the breakdown. So I don't know enough to be the one that makes the decision. I just know enough to get the right people in the room and have the conversation. And I think, in my opinion, is that this is not a complicated situation or a problem. We can rewrite the code, we can blank slate it, and have people that come in who write the code as a manufacturer, because they're the ones that, like, the way I look at this as an architect when I specify stuff, I'm looking at manufacturers and their information and making sure their performances and their things are meeting code, right? And the code is usually written in basically with help from those manufacturers, right? They have lobbyists, they have people coming in, they're doing all these studies and these third-party studies on all these different things, and that gets that comes down to the code, just like Shear. Shear is responsible for writing so much of the code or being involved with that. They're referenced. And to me, it's like, well, why aren't we just talking to Shear and some of these other groups to figure out how we should write our code that makes the most sense? They're the ones that are up to date, and they're selling a shit ton of these all over the country. They're not wrong. I mean, they're working, and I think that's, to me, is a very simplified version of it. And it's never been to me, it's not anything more than a engineering, math, innovation, technology problem we're solving for this, because it's all math. It's flow and other things that come down, but it's become a policy thing. And we're dancing around this, and you learn more and more about what's going on, and you see it, and you start trying to connect the dots. Like you've been for 2 years or however long you've been working. Too long. But you start connecting these dots, and your articles, when I read your articles, I was really impressed with how much research you did, and you still come back to a very unclear understanding because it's not clear, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
The feeling I get from the city is that they feel like everyone's trying to pollute ever. You know, we're trying to dump. It's
Right.
like
They do kind of make it seem like that.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like it's a little. It's like no one wants it to be. We want it to be good.
Yeah.
We just want to be
trying to protect it.
And then you
everyone wants to
ask a
protect
restaurant owner, do you want to have your pipes run up into your business?
Like nobody wants that.
Nobody wants that.
No,
Yeah.
it's like everyone wants the same goal. It's just we're making it very hard to get there.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have to.
And the grease production is you literally, there's other people who have figured out how much grease is produced in what type of restaurants, right?
Mm-hmm.
You take that grease production value per meal, multiply it times how many meals you're going to do a day, times 90 days. Now you have your grease production for 90 days, size a grease interceptor that'll house that grease in 90 days, and you're good to go.
Come get it cleaned.
Right. And the argument might be, well, I don't know how many meals I'm going to serve. Well, okay, if you're going to be building something, somebody is looking at the financials and is planning on serving this many meals a day.
It's not
Correct.
that hard
It's
when
not
you
that
know
hard.
when you know the number of seats that you're going to have.
You can do the math.
And the turnover, what are you making? How long is it going to take to have people? Are you fast casual? Are you a sit down long term? Are you like, this is a 7-course meal? I mean, you can do the math. It's just, it's not that complicated.
And the averages of all of those things already exist,
Yeah.
Right.
And they have already been captured by grease production sizing methodology. So if you have like square footage, you can put that in, and you there's a calculation to get square
That
footage to
tool
grease
you-
production. Yeah, the
You
tools.
guys have a cool tool.
Very cool tool on
played with it.
Cool
grease.
tool? Did you?
Yeah, that's a good one.
No, it's a new one.
They actually
funny.
call it Grease Monkey.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
It's
sizing
pretty cool.
program for shear.
Grease
It's
Monkey.
called
That's
Grease
funny.
Monkey. Yeah, it does a great job. But you can do square footage. You can do seats in the facility. If you don't have all of your number of meals per day, and it'll do the math for you. All of that data is captured in the grease production sizing methodology because
Yeah.
it's all about how much grease per meal, and all that data is out there. It's all been captured. It's all been cataloged. It's all been massaged.
There's
It's
thousands
there.
and thousands of restaurants across
thousands.
America.
And it
Tens of
doesn't,
thousands.
in the whole scheme of things, it doesn't matter if you bring in 10 more, like in 1 hour, you brought in 10 more Grubhub orders.
Right.
In the whole scheme of things.
Or if you had 10 more people that came in, what's the difference?
Because you're going to not have 10 people at some point.
Yeah.
And you're filling up
Right.
a
Capacity.
over 90 days.
Right.
It's going to fluctuate. And you've already concerned based on how much water and grease can go in that thing
Right.
at once. If worst case, going in there,
We're ready.
that's already, and anyway.
Yeah.
And that's why having the right people in the room to have this conversation and go through it, so the engineers understand that, hey, all this has been planned for. We're throwing things at the wall because the pandemic, but it doesn't matter whether in the restaurant or not. And how many more meals they can do, you can only put so much down that sink.
It's all about grease production.
Right.
How much grease can you produce? Let's capture it all.
Yeah.
Let's pump it out in 90 days. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
And why can't we do that in the most efficient manner with the least cost outlay?
Yeah.
Right. And
Right.
when right now, the way they've got it set up, we're doing it in the most inefficient manner in the highest cost outlay.
Yeah.
Right. It's punitive. Right. And a lot of these restaurant owners own restaurants in other places or have operated restaurants in other places, and they know how punitive it is. And they're like, why is it so different here? Why am I being punished? Well, I did that in other cities, and we still captured all of our grease. Why do I have to do this?
It's because I honestly think it's people trying to solve for problems that don't have the understanding of how you truly should solve the problem. Over years of doing that, setting these layers and add things on, and they're trying, but they just need some support.
Well, you need somebody that can actually change the code. Who is it that can change the code in
The city council.
environmental services? Can the city council actually change the city
They can
permitting
apply
code?
pressure, in my opinion.
No,
regulate.
the city council writes laws.
But is this a law? These are regulations, so I don't know if they're...
It's building permits.
There's stuff
who oversees
there's
the
stuff in
permitting
the
process?
code, and then what I have found is that the code says so much, but then the details,
That's a good
things like
point,
the
yeah.
40 seats,
That can be
things-
changed.
That can be changed. That could be changed with a stroke of a pen in
Yeah.
environmental services.
That's the other thing, too, is then
But-
making a decision to go back to just the state plumbing code, to start there, the city council, for sure they could do that.
Clark County did that. That's what Clark County did. They had a minimum 1,000 gallon. If you needed a grease interceptor, it had to be 1,000 gallons and it had to be outside. Yeah. They had that, and they hired some people that were very knowledgeable about grease. And they looked at the code and they're like, "This is not good for us."
Yeah.
And what they were doing prior to changing the code, their code, they were writing variances for every single grease interceptor, and they were allowing anything that you wanted to put in as long as it was sized appropriately, but using grease production value, and you could prove it. They were allowing it. They were approving every single variance.
Yeah.
And so there was almost no gravity grease interceptors going in. So they're like, well, we're just going to change the code. State plumbing code applies as long as you can prove to us how you sized it, and it was a manufacturer sizing or a sizing by, grease production method from ASPE or some other way, you're approved. We'll approve the permit. And all of their problems have gone away. They don't have any.
Well, you know what I think we did today? I think we, I don't know if we solved the problems, but we definitely gave people a lot to think about, right? We've opened up, we've talked about the issues, we've given them a lot of solutions, and I think they're pretty straightforward. Thank you for sitting down and talking to me. Luke, thank you for driving all the way up from Vancouver.
Absolutely.
And what's funny is that if we can help solve these issues, you'll have a hell of a lot more restaurants to write about over the next few years coming in, because we're going to simplify and make it easier for them.
Yeah, keep me busy.
I love it.
Those restaurants could thank all of us in some manner, right?
Yeah, I hope so.
A free dinner.
Listen, I do think you made a really big impact today, and I think, oh my gosh, and your articles, Kristine, you started the movement on this with
Movement.
I mean, seriously, and it's I'm glad we've got things rolling, but hopefully
I can only tell the stories, right? Like, it's not.
Shine the light on it.
I can shine the light. I'm shining lights. Yeah.
Well, you can tell the stories, and you can give us the information. We can be like, oh, and then I can make a phone call, and we can have a better conversation like we did today. And I think that's how you get the ball moving. But I want to thank you guys so much again, Kristine with the News Tribune, and Luke, United Sales Northwest. And Sheer, right? Is that your main representation, Sheer?
Sheer is a very big part of what we do, right?
Gotcha.
So as a manufacturer's rep, we represent a variety of lines because we're dealing with the same people and bringing more value for our customers and our manufacturers. But Sheer is a very large focus of what we do.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming in, guys. I really appreciate it. And
thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk again soon.
Hopefully.
Round 2 is going to be coming again, and we're going to be
Solutions
toasting
Day
and everything else.
Talking about the changes and all the good that they have done. That would be a great round 2.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Thank you.